Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this technical presentation by the Royal Institution of Naval Architects, New South Wales section and the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology, ACT and New South Wales branch. Our presenter this evening is John Jeremy. And John started his career as an apprenticeship draftsman at Cockatoo Dockyard and studied naval architecture part-time at the University of New South Wales, graduating in 1967. After a spell in Britain on a Vickers Limited postgraduate scholarship, he returned to hold a number of positions in the planning and technical areas before being appointed Technical Director of Vickers Cockatoo Dockyard and ending up as Managing Director of Cockatoo Dockyard in 1981, when the dockyard was busy modernising the RAN's Oberon-class submarines and building HMAS Success. The dockyard, which was leased from the Commonwealth, was closed in 1991. Cockatoo Dockyard has continued to occupy John's time in later years, writing 3 books on the history of the island facility and its work. John is a Fellow of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects. He is a past President of the Australian Division and was a member of the Australian Division Council for 38 years. He has been Chair of the Organising Committee for the series of international maritime conferences held in conjunction with the Pacific and now Indo-Pacific International Maritime Exposition since 2002. He is currently Editor-in-Chief of the Australian Naval Architect, the quarterly journal of the Australian Division. He was appointed a member of the Order of Australia, AM, in 2015 for the preservation and celebration of naval and maritime history. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll pass you over to John Jeremy.
Thank you, Phil. Good evening or good afternoon, everybody. Very pleased to have you join us for this little ramble through the world of submarines. Those of you who know me well will know that I can't really give any talk without starting with history, and I'm going to start with history again tonight because I think that's quite relevant. Because the development of the submarine was very rapid during the first decade of the 20th century. The British Admiralty ordered 5 small submarines from Vickers in 1901, and the first submarine for the Royal Navy was launched at Barrow-in-Furness on the 2nd of November 1901. Being built under license from the Electric Boat Company of the United States, which held the patents for the US-based Irishman John Holland's designs. And this small 104-ton submarine was only 63 feet 11 inches long and was the first of a long line of submarines to emerge from Barrow-in-Furness for the Royal Navy, including almost all British nuclear submarines. Of course, not all senior officers in the Royal Navy were convinced that submarines had a future. Some felt that they were unethical and un-English, the weapon of cowards who refused to fight like men on the surface. Yet by mid-1914, some 400 submarines were in service by 16 navies, an extraordinary adoption rate for a new technology, and most were derivatives of John Holland's original designs. World War I proved the value of the submarine as a weapon, primarily to sink enemy ships. In Australia, plans for the future Royal Australian Navy, which developed in the years following Federation, included coastal submarines, despite the embryonic technology. In 1907, Captain W.R. Cresswell, Director of the Commonwealth Naval Forces, argued strongly against submarines. But despite his advice, the government asked Vickers in Britain to quote for the supply of submarines for Australia. Britain offered 2 of the then under construction C-class, but the Navy remained opposed to the purchase. At one time, it was suggested that Vickers might supply parts for the submarines to be assembled at the New South Wales government-run Cockatoo Island in Sydney, in the same way that the first destroyer built in Australia, HMAS Warrego, was constructed between 1910 and 1912. Vickers discouraged this suggestion on technical grounds and, one suspects, reluctance to lose a developing market in the colonies. Ultimately, the Imperial College on Defence in London in 1909 established the concept of an Australian Fleet unit, which would include 3 submarines of the C-class. C-class for small submarines with low speed and limited endurance. Power for surface running and to charge the batteries was provided by petrol engines, which one can only describe as a hazardous selection. The proposed 3 C-class submarines were replaced by 2 of the E-class, and in December 1910, the Admiralty ordered 2 on behalf of the Royal Australian Navy for delivery in December 1912 and January 1913. These submarines were of about 800 tons with a length of 178 feet. They had 2 Vickers diesels and electric motors for a speed of 15 knots on the surface and 9 knots submerged. 56 boats of this design were subsequently ordered, and they became the backbone of the Royal Navy's submarine service during World War I. They represented the state-of-the-art of British submarine design at the time. Australia's first submarines, AE1 and AE2, as you were, pardon me, sitting there right already on the bottom left, were commissioned a bit late in February 1914. For such small vessels, the journey to Australia was something of a marathon and was finally completed in May 1914, partly under tow. Both were lost during the war, AE1 in September 1914 and AE2 in the Sea of Marmara after her penetration of the Dardanelles on the 25th of April 1915. The general layout of subsequent submarines did not vary much for many years, but there were some attempts to produce significantly faster submarines, notably the J-class and the K-class. Following the loss of AE1 and AE2, the Commonwealth government sought replacements from Britain, but British construction capacity was fully committed. The Australian Parliament was generally in favour of replacing the submarines, and although the government favoured building new warships in Australia, it was felt that the capability to build submarines was lacking. With continuing interest in local construction, in late 1916, the general manager of Cockatoo Dockyard, John King Salter, sent 10 men to Britain to study submarine construction. The team returned to Sydney in 1918 with considerable information on modern submarines and the equipment needed for their construction. However, as the end of the war approached, the possibility of the gift of submarines to Australia arose, and in January 1919, the Admiralty recommended to the British Cabinet that 6 submarines of the J-class be presented to Australia. J-class submarines were large and fast submarines capable of some 19 knots on the surface, and they were designed following a 1914 report, which was actually false, that the German Navy was building submarines capable of 22 knots on the surface. Despite their speed, the J-class boats were still too slow for a role which was then regarded as important, as fleet submarines operating with the battle fleet. In 1913, diesel engines were not believed to be able to provide the power required for this speed, and design work was begun at the Admiralty in 1913 on a large steam-powered submarine capable of a surface speed of 24 knots. In 1915, Vickers proposed a 3-shaft design combining steam and diesel power with the diesel on the centre shaft. The best features of this design were combined with the 1913 Admiralty design, resulting in one of the most novel and largest submarines of the time, the K-class. 27 were ultimately ordered, although only 17 were completed. It's a slight irrelevance, but the drawing you see there on the screen was one of the ones brought back from England in 1918. The K-class submarines were complex and difficult to handle. The safe diving depth was 200 feet, with a safety margin of about 50%. And the long submarine could easily exceed the safe depth when diving if great care wasn't taken, particularly as the hydroplanes had an unfortunate tendency to jam. The fastest diving time recorded was 3 minutes and 25 seconds. The reputation of the submarines suffered from an unfortunate series of accidents and collisions, but as fleet submarines, they were regarded as a success. We'll never know how they might have performed with the battle fleet in action, as all were completed after the Battle of Jutland. and the opportunity to test them in the role for which they were designed never arose. Only one ever engaged the enemy, hitting a U-boat with a torpedo which failed to explode. Most had a short service life. The longest was 9 years. In many ways, the K-class submarines were way ahead of their time. Steam power was not to return to submarines until USS Nautilus took the first nuclear reactor to sea in 1956. During the wars, British submarine development was largely concentrated on long-range patrol submarines, beginning with the O-class, two of which, Oxley and Otway, were built for Australia. These two submarines displaced about 2,038 tons submerged and were just less than 275 feet long. They arrived at the onset of the Depression, with heavy cuts in defence expenditure and restrictions on British submarine numbers imposed by the London Naval Treaty of 1930, and they were given to Britain that year. As war approached in the 1930s, British submarine development concentrated on three classes: the long-range T-class submarines of about 1,575 tons submerged displacement, a smaller class for coastal operations, the S-class, and a small submarine for training, the U-class, which were very similar in size to the old E-class. US Navy submarine development in the period of disarmament attempts between the wars was slow, but development gathered pace after 1931. During World War II, the United States built many very long-range patrol submarines. After 1941, 339 submarines were ordered to a standard design. 221 were completed during or just after the war. Very successful submarines, they could achieve 20.25 knots on the surface or 8.75 knots submerged. They had a patrol endurance of 75 days and a cruising range on the surface of 11,000 miles at 10 knots. Despite many years of development, these World War II submarines were still only achieving submerged speeds similar to the submarines of World War I. With diesel-electric propulsion, they had to spend considerable time on the surface to charge batteries, rendering them vulnerable to detection, particularly from the air or by radar. The big changes were in weapon capacity, range, and endurance, and diving depth. The German submarine built in very large numbers, the Type 7, which caused so much damage during the Battle of the Atlantic, was also a very conventional design. This submarine, of which there were several variants, was quite small, not much bigger than AE1 and AE2. It was the most numerous class of submarine ever built, with 703 boats completed, and submerged speed, however, was still only 7.6 knots. Two developments were made during the war which were to radically change the nature of submarine warfare. One was the snorkel, or snort as it's commonly known, and the other was the high-speed submarine. The snorkel, intended to enable a submarine to charge its batteries whilst submerged, was first patented, would you believe, by Scott's Shipbuilding and Engineering Company of Greenock in 1916, but the Admiralty made no use of the idea. Later, the Italians developed a similar concept, but it was a Dutch snorkel which attracted the interest of the Germans. Initially regarded simply as a means of ventilating the submarine, high losses in the Battle of the Atlantic during 1943 prompted its use for recharging the submarine's batteries when submerged. Snorkels were retrofitted to Type 7 and Type 9 submarines and were designed into later submarines. It's now, of course, commonly fitted to all diesel-electric submarines. Developed during the war, the German Type 21 submarine introduced some radical changes which were to greatly influence post-war submarine design. Of about 1,800 tons submerged, the Type 21 had a streamlined hull which permitted higher underwater speed with much less hydrodynamic noise, a much bigger battery which improved submerged endurance, power-loaded torpedo tubes, and improved crew accommodation. They were fitted with a snorkel from the outset, and they were the closest to a true submarine yet designed, or rather than a surface vessel which could submerge to attack or escape detection. Underwater speed was increased to about 18 knots for an hour and a half, or 12 to 14 knots for 10 hours. At an economical speed of 6 knots, they could manage 48 hours of silent running while submerged. Now, whilst in reality their performance was not quite as good as is believed, as Jim Lyon told us in a presentation, I think last year, they did have a radical influence on the way ahead. The Germans ordered 750 of these submarines, of which 118 were constructed between 1943 and 1945. There was no paralysis by analysis there. The boats were assembled from 8 prefabricated sections, and there were many quality problems with work from builders without previous warship and in particular submarine construction experience. Whilst the actual performance of the submarines, as I say, was not as good as commonly believed, it was perhaps fortunate for the Allies that only 4 Type 21 submarines were operational before the end of the war, and only 2 conducted combat patrols. With the development of 1 submarine, most of the large numbers of anti-submarine ships constructed during the war were rendered obsolete because they were too slow. As a further means of achieving high underwater speed, the Germans began the construction of small submarines of about 415 tons, powered by turbines with hydrogen peroxide as the source of oxygen and diesel oil as the fuel to produce steam. This dangerous method of propulsion promised submerged speeds of around 25 knots. The 3 completed submarines were scuttled by their crews in May 1945, but U-1407 was raised and rebuilt at Barrow with a new set of machinery captured at the end of the war. She was commissioned as HMS Meteorite, and curiously there is an Australian connection with this submarine and this project, because at the end of the war, the Admiralty sent a Royal Navy Marine engineer, Submariner, to Germany to retrieve a hydrogen peroxide submarine and a set of as much machinery as he could from the factories. And the young man sent was one Peter Scott Maxwell, who had a remarkable war career in HMS Tally-Ho in particular. And he went to Germany and arranged for the repatriation of the parts and the submarine, and later became involved, he joined Vickers and became involved with the establishment of the Admiralty Nuclear Reactor Research Facility at Dounreay in Scotland. Peter came to Australia in 1967 as managing director of Vickers Australia, and for nearly 20 years was also director of Cockatoo Dockyard, where I got to know him, and he was a very welcome, understanding mentor. For the submarine Meteorite was used for a few years for trials, and Britain subsequently built 2 high-test peroxide submarines, HMS Explorer and HMS Excalibur at Barrow. They were the fastest submarines in the world when they were completed. They were commonly known as Exploder and Excruciator because of the occasional large bursts of flame which would emit from the machinery exhausts, and the number of times the crew had to evacuate to the casing to escape the dense clouds of white smoke which would issue from every hatch. They were paid off in 1961, a very expensive experiment which was overtaken by the development of nuclear propulsion. The characteristics of the German Type 21 submarine were widely adopted after the war. Selected submarines were modernized, lengthened to accommodate larger batteries, and streamlined to improve underwater performance. The US Navy also modernized many World War II submarines as part of what they called the Greater Underwater Propulsive Power Program, or GUPPY. New submarines designed after the war also adopted Type 21 features, like the British Porpoise class and the Oberon class. With greatly enhanced batteries and more powerful electric motors, these submarines could achieve something like 17 knots submerged. The latter class, the Oberons, were regarded by many as one of the best diesel-electric submarines ever built. Australia decided to acquire a squadron of submarines again in 1960 and bought 6 Oberon-class submarines from Britain in what was, when you look back on it, a very well-managed program. Between 1978 and 1985, the RN submarines were given a world-leading Australian-initiated modernisation known as the Submarine Weapons Update Program, or SWUP for short, which enabled them to fire the US Mark 48 torpedo and the Harpoon anti-submarine missile, anti-ship missile rather, with new sonars and a modern digital combat system. And it was this successful program which helped give the Navy the confidence and the wish to do it all ourselves, which subsequently became Collins class. Despite the quality of the Oberons, they were still designed for relative efficiency on the surface rather than submerged. The best form for a submerged submarine is some form of prolate spheroid or a teardrop. In the early 1950s, the US Navy built a diesel-electric research submarine with this form, USS Albacore. This 1,500-ton submarine introduced a new pressure hull steel, HY80, which we're all very familiar with now, and tested new hydroplane configurations, anechoic tiles to reduce detection by active sonar, new propeller configurations, new pressure hull configurations, and features which are today common in submarines, both conventional and nuclear. Albacore was actually capable of 33 knots submerged. A visit to Albacore by the British First Sea Lord, Lord Louis Mountbatten, profoundly impressed him and greatly affected future UK submarine policy. In fact, the Oberon-class submarines very nearly didn't happen. Whilst Albacore's hull form was close to ideal, there are practical considerations which make it difficult for the ideal form to be used for operational submarines. These range from the simple requirement to be able to move around on deck to handle lines and so forth, to the necessary bottle-shaped pressure hull to provide for external ballast tanks at the ends, with the internal space restrictions and strength challenges as a consequence. More recently, the development of sonars has meant that high-power active sonars demand space in the bow. Passive sonars demand space on as long a baseline as possible within the submarine's casing or some other arrangement, and towed array sonars need space for the stowage of the array and the winch and handling equipment. The Australian Collins class submarines illustrate these demands very well, with a very large bow for the active passive sonar transducer, passive sonar windows in the casing for a passive sonar array, and a tail to stream a towed array clear of the propellers. It's all a hydrodynamic compromise which is necessary to make the whole system work. Despite all these improvements, the diesel-electric submarines retained this is the modern submarine, which has pressure hulls which are largely cylindrical with dome ends, streamlined fore and aft ends, and a faired casing. And it's as I say, it's a hydrodynamic compromise which is necessary to make the whole system work. And passive arrays are usually now conformal and fit around the outside of the pressure hull. Despite all these improvements, the diesel-electric submarine retains the limitations imposed by its propulsion plant. It has limited range when submerged, depending on speed, and must either surface or use the snort mast to recharge the batteries while submerged, or to make a high speed, and by high speed I mean sort of 10, 12 knots perhaps, submerged transit on diesels. These needs make it vulnerable to detection, and high-speed submerged transits, often part of the life of Australian submarines, place enormous strain on masts, diesel engines, and the crew. The advantages of conventional diesel-electric submarines are their relatively low cost and ready supportability, and particularly their ability to operate very quietly at low speeds, undetected in relatively shallow water conditions. For these loitering conditions, air-independent propulsion systems have been developed to increase underwater endurance at low speed, but these systems demand considerable space and some need volatile and dangerous fuel. The best way to create a true submarine is to fit a plant which does not require air and can enable the submarine to remain submerged indefinitely, and with its endurance limited only by that of the crew and the supplies which they require. That power plant is, of course, nuclear. Consideration of air-independent propulsion for submarines began on both sides of the Atlantic as early as 1943. In post-war Britain, priority was given to land-based nuclear power stations, and it was not until the mid-1950s that serious work began on the development of a nuclear submarine propulsion system. Meanwhile, in the United States, Westinghouse was authorized in December 1947 to design and test a nuclear power plant for a submarine. The pressurized water plant, which was developed, known as S2W, was of quite low power, about 10 megawatts, but formed the basis for the subsequent reactors which have powered nuclear ships and submarines of the US Navy. Construction of the first nuclear submarine, USS Nautilus, was begun by General Dynamics Electric Boat Division in June 1952, and she was completed in April 1955. The construction was supervised by a remarkable US Navy officer, Captain, later Admiral, Hyman G. Rickover, a powerful personality who propelled US nuclear submarine program with unstoppable determination for many years. He was one of the longest serving US Navy officers ever, finally retiring at the age of 82. And it is said that some US presidents were inclined to address him as Sir. Nautilus displaced about 4,000 tons and had a submerged speed of about 23 knots. And the US Navy ceased building diesel-electric submarines in the 1950s. The first British nuclear submarine was HMS Dreadnought, completed by Vickers at Barrow in April 1963. She had a US-supplied Westinghouse S5W nuclear plant as fitted in the contemporary American Skipjack-class submarine. This had been made possible by a unique and exclusive agreement in 1958 to allow British access to US nuclear propulsion technology. The respectful working relationship between Rickover and Mountbatten was crucial to making that agreement happen. Later British submarines had UK developed propulsion plants, although the relationship between UK and US programs and between the US reactor builders and Rolls-Royce, the manufacturer of the British submarine reactors, remains close today. Rickover had a brusque and demanding manner. He was said to unwind only in the presence of some people: the Queen, Harold Macmillan, Lord Mountbatten, and later Sir Solly Zuckerman, the chief scientific advisor at the Ministry of Defence. He was described as having a very peculiar and temperamental behaviour and considered himself sent by the deity into this world to see that America remained supreme. When showing Lord Mountbatten around USS Skipjack in 1958, Mountbatten recalled him saying, "Admiral, I think your British setup is lousy. What you want to run a show like this is a real son of a bitch." Mountbatten delighted Rickover with his reply. "That's where you Americans have the edge on us. You have the only real son of a bitch in the business." Early nuclear submarines may have been fast, but they were noisy when compared to modern diesel-electric submarines. Whilst they were sent to sound like an express train, they had the advantage of speed, being able to outrun the homing torpedoes of the day, and the chance of actually sinking one after an attack was regarded as extremely low. They also provided a perfect platform to move the nuclear deterrent to sea in ballistic missile submarines. The first US Polaris submarine, USS George Washington, a stretched attack submarine, was completed in 1959, and the first British Polaris submarine, HMS Resolution, was completed in 1967. The adoption by Britain of the US ballistic missile was made possible by an historic agreement between President Kennedy and Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, which was concluded in Bermuda on the 21st of December, 1961. It was actually not long after that, in 1967, that I obtained my first exposure to the world of nuclear submarine construction in Britain on a Vickers postgraduate scholarship. And I spent time at Barrow at the peak of the Polaris program. As an Australian, I was unable to access anything nuclear and not supposed to see anything Polaris, or that was a bit difficult. But I managed to obtain valuable knowledge of the systems used to manage the construction and trials of nuclear submarines, which was of great assistance for setting up our refit procedures in Sydney for the RAN's Oberon-class submarines. I was also able to meet two of the titans of the nuclear submarine program. That's some submarines under construction at the time. But I was able to meet two very important and interesting men. One was the Vickers Chief Polaris Executive, Len Redshaw, later Sir Leonard, and the other was the Ministry of Defence's Roland Baker, later Sir Roland, who was the technical director of the Polaris Executive. The Barrow shipyard, now part of the British global defence company BAE Systems, continues to be the centre of British nuclear submarine construction today. Currently completing the Astute-class attack submarines, Barrow is also building 4 new design Trident ballistic missile submarines, the Dreadnought class, to replace the existing vessels now approaching the end of life, which will maintain Britain's seaborne nuclear deterrent. The program is closely related to the US Columbia-class program, which will occupy much of the US nuclear submarine construction capacity in coming years. Today, 6 nations have or are developing a submarine-borne nuclear deterrent. Those submarines may disappear into the world's oceans to remain undetected and ready to strike, but throughout the Cold War, a major role of the attack nuclear submarine was to detect an opponent's SSBN when they left harbour, possibly in company with another submarine for protection, to shadow them while trying to remain undetected, ready to destroy the SSBN if necessary, before it could unleash its destructive power. The escorting submarine's job was to try and find that shadowing submarine, ready to destroy it before it could do its duty. These roles drove efforts to make nuclear submarines quieter, and today the modern nuclear submarine can rival a modern conventional submarine for stealth, as evidenced when a French ballistic missile submarine and a British ballistic missile submarine tried to occupy exactly the same piece of water in the North Atlantic on one occasion some years ago. Submarines make a particularly good anti-submarine weapon, and nuclear submarines have a major role in protecting surface forces, particularly US carrier battle groups. It's the intended role of the K-class, fast forward 100 years. The deployment of the HMS Queen Elizabeth task group to the Indo-Pacific last year, which was actually a multinational task group, also included a British nuclear submarine. It is said that a shadowing Chinese nuclear submarine was very quickly detected once the group had entered the South China Sea. Now, what's the role of the modern submarine? I think this audience has got a pretty good idea about the role of the modern submarines, and I don't really intend to go through all of these in any detail for this audience, but it's interesting actually that the conventional role of submarines like anti-ship warfare and things are fairly well down the line. Covert role of the submarine has very much overtaken some of their more conventional roles. But there is a new role which is emerging rapidly, and I think that's one that is certainly going to affect the future of submarine design and submarine operations. And that is the role of deploying uncrewed underwater vehicles, of controlling UUVs, detecting and neutralizing hostile UUVs, which have potential to pose a considerable threat the defence of ports and trade routes. Protection of underwater assets like undersea communications and power cables is also vital. Communications with the world, some might regard as being highly vulnerable. Australia's Collins-class submarines are amongst the largest and most capable diesel-electric submarines in the world. All submarines are expensive to operate and maintain, not least because of their complexity and the importance of submarine safety. But why do we need such big and expensive submarines? Europe, and particularly Germany, has for decades provided the world's navies with high-quality diesel-electric submarines of around 1,500 to 2,000 tons displacement. The latest types are, however, getting bigger, but are still generally designed to operate in relatively shallow littoral waters. Germany and Norway have recently signed contracts for the construction of 7 new submarines, which are not only larger, but adopt an unusual hull form which sacrifices some hydrodynamic performance for sonar stealth. By contrast, the US Navy's latest class of nuclear submarine, the Virginia-class Block 4, displace around 8,000 tons, have an S9G reactor of 30 megawatts for a submerged speed of around 25 knots, and a range limited only by the endurance of the crew of 135 and their supplies, and a weapon load of torpedoes and long-range ground attack missiles. In the latest version, Block 5, they can carry a torpedo and missile load of up to 65 weapons. They will be immensely powerful vessels. They're also eye-wateringly expensive, at around US 3.6 billion a copy. That's about 5.1 billion Australian dollars a copy. And I'm not sure that that actually includes the reactor. The design, which dates from the early 1990s, is also now a little bit dated. 2 shipyards in the US build the Virginia-class submarine, General Dynamics Electric Boat, and Huntington Ingalls Industries, with a shared workload between the yards. Production of the Virginia class is expected to continue into the 2040s, but the US has recently begun the design of their successor, now entitled SSNX, which is expected to be even larger. Construction of the first submarine of the new design is planned to begin around 2034. The latest British attack submarine design is the Astute class. The design, which was prepared in close collaboration with Electric Boat, dates from the late 1990s, and the first submarine, HMS Astute, was completed in 2010. The last of the 7 is expected to be completed in 2024. The submarines are smaller than the Virginia class at about 7,400 tons and have a length of 97 meters compared to 10,200 tons and 140 meters for the latest Block 5 version of the Virginia class. The complement's only 97 compared to 135 in the Virginia class. On the 17th of December last year, Australian time, the UK Secretary of Defence announced contracts for BAE Systems and Rolls-Royce for the design development of a new class of submarine to succeed the Astute class. The type of submarine for Australia depends on the payload we want our submarines to carry and the way in which we intend to operate them. The defence of Australia and our trade is a maritime task. Our maritime interests extend from the North Pacific to the Western Indian Ocean. And these operational areas could be a very long way from the submarine's base, currently at HMAS Stirling at Garden Island, south of Perth. Our submarines are required to transit long distances undetected from their base to their operational area and back again. Many modern submarines, like those sold in large numbers to other navies around the world, operate close to home. Australian submarines have a long way to go to work. demanding high transit speeds and long endurance. And this chart from a recent ASPE publication is interesting in giving some indication of the comparison of endurance and performance between a diesel electric submarine in our world and a nuclear submarine. The adoption of nuclear power would make an enormous difference to the time it would take an Australian submarine to transit to a patrol area and the time the submarine can remain on station. Surely, you might ask, if we've got to go so far as quickly as we can, why have we not bought nuclear submarines in the past? Well, it's a good question, isn't it? But until now, we've been unable to gain access to the nuclear technology of our principal allies. The barriers to US and UK nuclear submarine technology have been impenetrable. Access to such technology is essential if the RAN is to go nuclear. Well, in my opinion, it is anyway. As we do not have a commercial nuclear industry, a lone path to an Australian submarine reactor would take decades, probably. Despite the obstacles, many have promoted nuclear power for Australian submarines for years, but to no avail. The momentous announcement of the 16th of September last year that the RAN will go nuclear with a planned fleet of at least 8 submarines to a US or UK design has changed everything. There is, of course, a lot of work to do, and some of which I've put here on this screen. We need, right up the top really, a naval nuclear regulatory framework for Australia. And whilst our Panzer provides a basic framework, there is a lot to do, noting the requirements and implications of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as well. We've got to decide how we're going to build them and where we're going to build them. The government policy is in Australia at Adelaide, where facilities are, well, actually under suspension at the moment, but there's plenty of room and the opportunity to build a state-of-the-art facility. But perhaps we should not lose the possibility that first 1 or 2 come from overseas. The submarine bases, well, that's virtually decided, which will be at Stirling in Western Australia, and an East Coast base at Brisbane, Newcastle, or Port Kembla. We could debate which one of those is going to succeed. And we need to define the nuclear-specific facilities at these locations, reminding ourselves also that they have to be safe from all sorts of things, including, for example, seismic events. We've got to accept the presence of the submarines, and very importantly, we've got to establish a training program for civil and naval nuclear engineers. Well, this has actually started with 300 scholarships offered for nuclear science and engineering, and the training of Navy personnel has now been approved by the US in the US, for Australia, and in the UK. And that, if not already underway, will be very shortly. And with nuclear submarines, you've got to think about the end of service life as well. What are you going to do with them and dispose of them safely once their world has ended, their role has ended? And this work has all now started. Of course, we'd entered into a relationship with France for the design of new submarines to replace the Collins class, which was to be based upon the French Barracuda class nuclear submarine. Design work had been underway for some years on a challenging task of converting a nuclear submarine into a diesel electric boat. It was to be effectively a new design, completely new after the engine room bulkhead, and substantially new forward, with changes to the combat system, weapons, weapon discharge system, masts and communications. Whilst I've no doubt that the attack class would have been a very fine submarine and very probably the best conventional diesel electric submarine ever built, the challenges of range, speed and endurance would have remained, and the new submarines would have added little capability beyond that of the Collins class. One might ask, if we were decided to go nuclear, why not the French Barracuda class? Well, substantial redesign would be necessary in any case, for some of the reasons I've already mentioned, but a significant consideration would be the type of nuclear reactor fitted in the French submarines. It uses fuel enriched to a much lower level than the US or British reactors, and the submarines would require refueling every 7 to 10 years, a very expensive and demanding task, which in our case would probably have to be done overseas, in the absence of a commercial nuclear industry with its associated infrastructure. The modern US and British submarines are fueled for life using highly enriched uranium fuel. The AUKUS agreement has admitted Australia to a club, the doors of which have been firmly closed to everyone for decades. So what happens now? On the 22nd of November, an exchange of nuclear propulsion information agreement was signed by Australia and the AUKUS partners, the United Kingdom and the United States. This agreement gives Australia access to sufficient information for determining the best route to acquiring a nuclear submarine for the RAN. Once that route is determined, hopefully within the next 6 or 9 months or so, further agreements would be necessary. And it's interesting to note that the AUKUS agreement notes that it is to be replaced by a subsequent agreement no later than the 31st of December 2025, and the US-UK agreement, to which we have not had access before, is due for renewal by the end of 2024. Maybe it will become a tripartite agreement. Now, when I give this kind of presentation, I allow myself to do a little speculation. And I would comment that I think that when you're talking about a project like this, speculation on the way ahead is a unique privilege of people who are not in the least bit involved. And I'm not in the least bit involved, therefore perhaps I'm qualified. What are we going to do? Will we decide to build a Block 4 or 5 Virginia-class submarine or an Astute-class submarine? The US submarine and its successor is very big, demanding of crew, and very expensive. Astute is closer to the right side, but the design is now a bit dated, and production will end very soon. Steelwork production has. In my opinion, though, the best nuclear submarine for Australia could be a British design. If we are to obtain the first new submarine in the shortest possible time, then that is probably Astute. The new design that's on the way, let's call it Son of Astute, will have the advantage of a new reactor, PWR3, instead of the older PWR2 in Astute, into which PWR3 will not fit, I believe. And the integration of other underwater assets like UUVs would be better. It's likely to be a bit larger than the Astute class. Whilst the selection of Son of Astute would probably delay the program, I find it hard to believe that the announcement of design contracts for Son of Astute one day after AUKUS was announced was completely a coincidence. Perhaps the British route might be 2 Astutes followed by Son of Astute, with Australia contributing to the design of the latter. I suspect, however, that there will be strong wishes for the RAN to follow the US route with the Block 4 Virginia class, despite the considerable cost. Of course, AUKUS has not happened simply because Australia would like nuclear submarines. Our AUKUS partners are likely to have considerable influence on the final outcome, in my opinion. Their strategic interests will be important. They are the partner. Whatever submarine we decide to choose, BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, Electric Boat, HII, are all likely to have some hand in the project. And of course, several of them are well established in Australia. Decision is expected by the middle of next year. In fact, I think they're talking about March. And as I say, possibly earlier. The project is enormous for a country like Australia, but I believe it can be done. It's a challenge which is similar to that faced by the UK in the early 1960s. We'll need inspirational leadership, the modern equivalents of Rickover, Redshaw, and Baker, and the UK's Chief Polaris Executive, Admiral Sir Hugh Mackenzie, to drive our project forward with relentless determination and a blank checkbook. There are also great risks with the path that we have chosen, and I've enumerated them, some of them here. We have to ensure that we can maintain a submarine force until the nuclear submarines come into service. the life of the Collins class must be extended. It's a very demanding project in itself, which is scheduled to begin in 2026. We're not alone in this kind of demand. The US Navy is extending the life of their older nuclear submarines for a not dissimilar reason, to prevent a gap in capability. We've got to recruit and train the many people, which is actually thousands, who will be needed to build and to serve in the new submarines. Well, of course, some of the latter haven't yet been born. We've got to create the new nuclear qualified facilities in Adelaide for the construction of the submarine, and in Western Australia and on the East Coast for the submarine bases and maintenance facilities. And we've got to take great care that the high cost of going nuclear does not starve the RAN of the funds it will need to fulfill its other essential roles in the maritime defence of Australia. Now, these risks are recognised, but meeting a program which aims to have a Royal Navy nuclear submarine in service well before 2038, a target of the previous government, is a considerable national challenge. As I say on this slide, there's no going back now. Let's get on with it. And I can't help thinking that Peter Scott Maxwell, were he still alive and with us today, would simply say, John, it's a challenge. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.